All right, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. We try to do a special thing where we're doing a serving spotlight. So what we're doing usually is taking someone from our church and understanding exactly what they do in the church, their daily life, and how they contribute. And so again, we like to try to get different people. So if you think you might be interested in it, you go to our church or whatnot, we'll definitely get you some questions beforehand. But currently, we're going to be talking to our very own Matt Mahaffey, the youth pastor of Northside Church.
What it do?
What it do? And so we're going to go into kind of some questions to kind of get, the framework of his, theology and, his strategy for dealing with youth ministry. So I think the biggest thing is, what is your vision for youth ministry, Matt? Well, kind of give us a spotlight of what that looks like.
Well, here over the last several years, because I've had essentially two separate groups of students. Since when I first started, they were much older. Most of them were in high school, so I could get a little deeper with them. They'd kind of been given the milk, you should say. So it was like going into meat and potatoes sort of deal with them almost. And then obviously they transitioned out, they graduated, they moved on. A lot of them are married now or in careers, and it makes me feel very old. But, we had this new group essentially come in. They're all pretty young for the most part, 12, 13, 14 years old. So essentially what I like to try to do, what I've been doing, at least with them, because this is like the first group I've had where I've really had them from start to finish, like 6th grade through 12th grade sort of deal. And so early on, I was trying to think what do they really need? Do we need to start with the basics first, get up to basis and all that? So a lot we did an entire year on discipleship, to say the least, what it truly means to follow Christ in our lives, right? So we spent an entire year on that. And then last year we tried to do a lot of what does it mean to talk, to people about our faith, what that looks like and everything. And you were there for it and saying it was there for it. And it got interesting for sure. Definitely an important thing to do. But a lot of them, they're getting a little older now because, again, I've had them for, a few years, several years going on now. So a lot of my focus, at least for this year too, is taking things a little bit deeper, making things a little more challenging because they have matured a lot over these last few years and everything. So I want to take a deeper look into discipleship and a deeper look into what it really means to follow Jesus in our lives. We've gotten a lot past the basics. We've gone through a lot of the Old Testament into the New Testament. We've talked about how the Bible is all one story pointing to Christ. And now I really want to look into seeing what that means for our everyday lives. It's not just Wednesdays and Sundays. It's it's a thing that you live out every single day. And essentially by the time that they graduate high school and get into college, that they're so deeply rooted in their faith and have an understanding of what their faith is, that they won't stray away from it, or nothing else will be able to convince them otherwise of who Jesus Christ is. You know what I mean? Because essentially, and I've told them before, I'm once you're out of youth group, I'm I can't live your life with you, So I want to make sure that they're prepared and deeply rooted enough to where obviously they can always come to me in life and things like that. But I want them to be so deeply rooted in their relationships with Christ and with each other to where when they get out into the world that nothing's going to shake that faith, and that they'll hold on to that. And then hopefully, that they'll stay connected in the church, whether they go off to college and find one there, or whether they go straight into the work field and maybe stay home and go to church. The goal is to always just to carry Jesus with them everywhere they go, and realistically, it's not always going to happen. We can't always believe we're going to save every single student that comes through here. They're all going to be serving the Lord for the rest of their lives, because that's just not the case. It's not going to happen. But we want to make sure that we do everything possible within our power and what God gives us to make sure that they have a complete understanding of who Jesus is, what he came to do, what that means for their lives, and how they can take that into the world and show other people what it's done for them, to where maybe they can also continue to make disciples. I mean, it's disciples making disciples making disciples. It's to continue to grow the kingdom and bring other people closer to Christ. So that's a lot of what we're going to try to do this year too, is challenge them a little bit more, really get into the meat and potatoes of things and be okay, we've done a lot of the basics. We've talked about what it means to be a disciple. Now let's really look into what it means to follow Jesus.
Right. And I'm glad you say that, because again, it's something that you've kind of integrated with the youth, is that you talk about. It's once you leave this place here, it's, a nice, comfortable place where each person grows differently, which is something that we've kind of talked about. It's a picture on hanging on the wall in there. How do you think that you can engage that with kind of how you connect with teens? How do you engage with students that grow differently, that may not be on the same, I would say, theological level as others, or aren't as mature as the others?
Sure. Well, the good thing is too, because obviously we have a mixed group of kids, right? We've got some that are, homeschooled or co-op, whatever you want to call it. We got some that are in the public school system. So obviously those two ways of learning are a lot different from each other. And so when you get two separate, I guess, places of learning, and then you bring them all together in one room and they're trying to get the same kind of learning from me, it can be a challenge, because you are having to try to cater to each one a little bit differently, but the same, if that makes sense. So essentially, you kind of watch how they all hang out with each other, and like they all have a lot of similar interests and a lot of similar things.
Like
so it's
airsoft is
like airsoft's a very big one for all of them. I don't get it, but I mean, I'm old.
More power
now,
to them. We
so
are old.
More power to them. Yeah. So, but it's one of those things like you have to study them. You know what I'm saying? Like outside of your normal meeting times and things like that, you kind of have to watch them and see how they process things sometimes, because again, you can go through lessons and, they may ask questions and they'll be like, stuff like that. And you kind of get an understanding for how they're picking things up from, even like while I'm teaching, I can almost
gauge if they're engaged
exactly. Yeah. You can see how each one's getting it or understanding it by like little comments that they make and all that. So I can generally take that and be like, okay, well, this approach to trying to get them to understand this, works for some of them, but not for the majority, right? So it's like, let's look at a different way to where we can help them understand in that sense. So it's kind of like watching them and engaging with them, even like during a lesson time almost, to see, okay,
so
like
you're kind of adjusting yourself as you're seeing people either get it or you're trying to think of a different way to explain it to help
exactly.
them.
It's kind of like, and it's a weird way to look at it, like sports analogy wise, like, quarterbacks, when they get out onto the field, the coach tells them like, hey, run Alpha, Bravo, Delta, whatever. And they're like, okay, well, they get out there and they notice a shift in the defense and they call audibles. It's like, okay, well, I noticed this. I got to change the play up because they're coming from this direction. So it's almost kind of like that in a sense.
Right.
And it's like that with preaching sometimes too. Like you can kind of see like how it's going while you're teaching, and even by some questions they're asking or by some comments they're making, and you can kind of take it, almost call an audible and go in a different direction. I'm like, okay, this is how I structured my lesson to be. Let's change it up a little bit to where, okay, I was going to go this direction, but let's, take it back a little bit this way and maybe break it down just a little bit more and get a little more detailed with it. So that way they get an understanding. And sometimes when you do that, and I've had to do it before where this was supposed to be like the lesson for this week, and I might have to split it into two and make it a two-parter, because like you have to go into a little more detail sometimes. And then like, okay, well guys, we'll pick up on this a little more next week since we had to detail it a little bit more, or if they get a little more distracted. So,
and I think that shows good teaching quality, right? So you're able to identify like where their weaknesses is, like in learning, and maybe not. So I think that's definitely a good thing. There is always an atmosphere of fun, within youth ministry. We do have a lot of fun. Obviously, we have to kind of reel them back in sometimes when they go off on these little tangents. They say these random things like
a
they'll
lot
quote
more than you think.
Right. They'll quote a random TikTok, and then it'll kind of derail it a little bit. But I guess that kind of leads into the question, how do you balance fun and Bible learning exactly with our group of teens, for instance, just to kind of give the parents a little insight into that.
You guys are going to get a lot of in-depth with all this stuff too, kind of what we do. And it kind of goes back to the previous question a little bit too, because again, you're catering to certain areas and how they learn. One example, for instance, we did a lesson on, prayer, like how can we pray? How do we pray? And so I went to Taco Bell and got like the Taco 12 pack boxes and brought, tacos or whatever. And I told them, hey guys, we're having tacos tonight. They're just thinking, yeah, Matt's bringing tacos. This is awesome. Well, I used it for an acronym for how we should pray, right? Like tacos was the acronym, like thanksgiving, adoration, confession, others, and self. Like kind of in that order. Like first and foremost, we give thanks to God for all that he's done, all that he's doing. Go into adoration, like God, you are great, mighty, awesome, powerful, things like that. Then confession, like your own things in your life, like God, just forgive me where I failed you in this area. Like I keep doing this and I keep doing it over and over again. I'm so sorry. And then the O, you go to others, praying for other people. And then obviously S, the last one being self. Because I mean, obviously, yes, we have things going on in our lives, but let's put some other things ahead of us first, because we're always so self-focused. And so we essentially use the tacos as the acronym, and to like, it fed them for sure, because who doesn't love tacos, right?
Tacos are always amazing.
Used it as an acronym to how to pray, because like a lot of times they have questions like the disciples did, like how do we pray, how do we read our Bible, how do we do this? And you take something as simple as a Taco Bell taco, it can break it down into an acronym to show them, like, and it sticks with them.
Yeah, because I see something like that every day. For most teens, just to be realistic, they love Taco Bell, the fast food stuff. It was a fantastic example to kind of connect those. So,
yeah,
for
absolutely. Sure. And then we use like some other examples before too. Like here, just recently, we were talking about like how we dictate our feelings.
Had a muscle spasm.
That was weird. He's getting goosebumps.
I'm getting goosebumps.
But yeah, here recently we did a recent study of how we dictate what our feelings are telling us to determine from what God's telling us, because we get our feelings mixed up with what we believe, like, oh, God told me I'm going to marry this girl. No, he didn't. So we kind of talked about that a little bit and used the example of the movie Inside Out, with the feelings inside of our head, like trying to control things.
I wonder what's going on inside of their head.
Yeah, what's going on inside their head. And it shows like the feelings, like one's trying to control them. They're trying to hit the button to get them to do this and do that. I'm like, kind of teaching discernment a little bit from that too. So just little fun things like that. And then of course we have what we call family nights. First Wednesday of every month, we get together at 6:00. Everybody eats a meal together before we meet for Bible study and everything like that. And that in and of itself is a time that we use just for fellowship, to build relationships together, because we do a lot of team games that way, because it's good to have that connection and build community that way. Because again, they're still teenagers, right? They go to school Monday through Friday. They're in a structured set, that many times during the week. So it's nice to kind of get them to unwind a little bit too, because we do try to go a little deep with them. And so we kind of use those times too, to just have some fun, grow in fellowship, have some food and enjoy each other's company that way. And we've done games like that before too. Like we've taken lessons we've done before and done like
wars.
Yeah, for sure. Like water wars. Oh my gosh, awful. So bad.
Yeah. So if anyone knows, Matt is not big on water. So
I hate
he
it.
As a youth pastor is very sacrificial in that sense. We've talked about that in other podcasts. So for Matt to have done that,
hate it.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, again, so, we've been talking about that with youth ministry and all that. And so I guess kind of to go in some background, right? So you do a good bit for the church. What does a typical week for you look like? I know we're all busy when we engage with, obviously our daily lives, you're married and you're bivocational, so you have your careers and stuff. How do you manage that with youth ministry? Can it be frustrating at times?
Yeah, absolutely it can. Yeah, and I've had that conversation with God many times, back and forth. But it's difficult, especially when I first started off doing it. Because one, obviously, I got to work a full-time job, right? Because I'm essentially, I guess, what you'd call, I don't know if you'd say part-time employee of the church. Like I have a salary, I guess you could call it, but it doesn't get me by in life. Like, so I got to work a job to, make ends meet, because I got a family. But essentially, Monday through Friday is my schedule at the retirement home, 8 to 4 generally. Sometimes it runs a little over. Sometimes I got to go in a little bit earlier. And I'm driving seniors to their doctor's appointments all day, scheduling appointments, making phone calls, like communicating with the nurses to get everything going on.
Very busy.
Very, very busy, very high-paced area. If you work in healthcare, you understand. Like, it's a very high-paced, high-structured environment that you're in. So going in on top of that and then going home, usually I get home before Andrea does, because she works a little bit later than I do. And so I can get home, take care of the dog, get her outside and all that. And a lot of times, especially like on Mondays, I'm like, okay, I'm sitting down. I'm going to go ahead and post the sermon from Sunday onto the website for people to be able to watch, because we have people that watch from the website. I'm sitting down. I'm structuring that. I'm looking into, okay, it's Monday, 2 days from now. We got youth group. If I'm doing like a particular series that day, I'm looking into that. Like, okay, what were we talking about this week? This is the first point I want to make to structure this. And I'm sitting down, and generally what I'll do is I'll type out essentially when I'm reading from scripture and what I want to say and how I want to word it. And I'll just type whatever's in my head and go from there. And then from that, and I have to do it with my sermons too, it's like, okay, let's take out the pieces that aren't necessarily essential, because we can get to talking and everything and probably say a little too much.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
So I'm breaking it down. It's like, okay, we can take this out, unstructure this, that's just repeated there, whatever. And kind of breaking it down that way. And then I'm looking at it then, I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. Does it make sense to them? Because again, different learning level. Not saying we're smarter than them, but there's different levels of learning between
right. So our maturity versus their, trying to bridge the gap.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like breaking it down on a level that they can understand, because you don't have to completely like dumb down the gospel for them. They understand more than what we think. But you still want to teach it on a level and maybe even give some examples to where they can kind of understand and piece it together, because there's probably a lot of stuff that I say sometimes they're like, what the heck does that mean? And so it's like, okay, how can I word this in a way that they'll understand what's going on, or figure out how much detail I need to go into it, right? And I'm structuring it that way. So I'm getting ready for Wednesday essentially like that. And then I'm looking at other things in the church that I might need to do also, because sometimes Pastor Ronnie will ask me for some things, or he might text me like, hey, can you preach for me this Sunday? Things of that nature. And so a lot of times I'm like looking at those lessons for like that Wednesday and then kind of going over that lesson for the next couple days. until eventually we get to Wednesday, and then I'm getting prepared. And usually I try to leave a little earlier on Wednesdays when I've been working all day, so that way I can have time to get home, get changed, make it over here, look over all my stuff before Wednesday, make sure everything's set up, get our stuff set up here. Of course, we're teaching. Then we got podcast stuff going on, talking about topics, discussions, what we're going to do.
So it can be taxing for sure.
It can be very taxing, very, very taxing. So, and then usually a lot of times those Thursdays, it's like, okay, we got Sunday school coming up, because I'm also looking at our Sunday school structure. It's like, okay, this is what, and I've got a lot of stuff written down ahead of time. I'm like, okay, we're going to cover this week, do this the next week, because the Wednesday structure is different from the Sunday morning structure. Like Wednesdays, like we're doing these series on growing them deeper. And then on Sunday mornings, we were doing a lot of stuff about context for scripture. And then we're taking this is what Philippians 4:13 says. It gets taken out of context and see what it's really talking about, giving them a lot of context in the mornings. And here recently, we've been doing a lot of how to grow deeper in your faith and ways in that way as well. Trying to differentiate between what we're doing on Wednesdays and what we're doing on Sundays. And then, of course, in between times, too, like usually after Sunday, I'm winding down the rest of the day, spending time with family, of course, because you got to make time for all three. It's work, church, family, all within the same time. And usually Andre gets home, we have dinner together. We're watching, wrestling together sometimes. Here recently been really interested in the Beast games, watching that together, just spending that kind of quality time together as well.
Definitely need that.
And then I'm really bad, too, about... like laying in bed sometimes and having a thought or an idea and then like doing stuff on my phone too. Like there's something constantly going through my head, whether it's about work, whether it's about church, whether it's stuff going on with family, especially with like Micah playing sports too. It's like, okay, he's got a sports schedule. And then sometimes that runs into, it's like, but I got to do this. I got to do that. Got to make time for, Andre here. Got to, do my job here. And then sometimes even at work, like on my lunch break, if I'm not eating with coworkers, I'm in my office on my lunch break doing stuff for youth group, and it's a tough balance to find. And I think I finally have a structure now to where I know, like, okay, on these days, focusing on church, and then this time during the day, once Andrea's off of work, structuring it around her, and all that stuff. Sure. And then with friends too, because we all play Fortnite stuff together sometimes too. And
so that kind of goes into the fun and, the Bible teaching, because, again, it does require that leaders, youth pastors, that they engage in relational things like, doing life together. So sometimes involves us old people playing Fortnite and video games. We're not built for that anymore. But again, that's something that's very, very important. So
I wish I could give you a more structured schedule, but I guess I could, but like the way I do it, it's structured, but it's not structured. To me, it's structured, but to you, it sounds like it's all over the place.
Chaos, but organized
chaos. It's
organized
chaos. Like in my mind, I've got it structured and it makes sense for how I got it laid out. For you, it just seems like, gosh, it's just everywhere. But in my mind, it makes sense.
No, you're totally fine. So again, like the emphasis for you definitely is, discipleship, making sure that they're getting in the word, they're understanding it, they're not, being contradictory in that, and also they're being disciples. And so it sounds like you have a good direction. And speaking on behalf of, me and Sandon, who sit in on lessons, definitely good to see. Not critiquing. I know he said in the other episode, we just sit there and judge, but it's like sometimes
I've seen the clipboard.
Listening. Clipboard, yeah. I whip out a clipboard every so often and like an observation. No, that was unfortunate. How dare you misuse that verse?
That's a demerit.
Which he doesn't, but... so again, the whole purpose of these serving spotlights is to kind of highlight some things we may not always understand about serving in the church, what ministry involves. So I think a lot of times we only see the front portion of it. So like it's like you're writing a paper, right? And so you'll read and you'll have to pick and choose the things that you use, and it's kind of the same thing in ministry, right? So there's some things that we don't always see that you're doing, but we judge just what we see based on it. And so you may be doing all sorts of things, and you might be pouring so much into it.
Yeah, there's a lot behind the scenes, and that's, like Pastor Ronnie too. Anybody that's involved in like ministry like that, there's a lot behind the scenes that people don't see. Because I've had people I've worked with before, like currently in my other job before, they were like, it must be nice to only work 2 days a week. I'm like,
oh, okay.
If only you knew.
That's like I get about the teacher thing about, it's like, oh, well, you get the summer off. Like,
not really, though.
Not exactly.
I mean, especially in the summertime, because then there's camps and retreats you got to think about. So that adds to what you're already doing on top of that as well. So, I mean, it's a lot. It really
definitely is. So I say, on behalf of our church, we're thankful that you serve and what you do in your leadership, and definitely an integral part of Northside for sure. It wouldn't happen without you, Pastor Ronnie, our various leaders. I guess the biggest thing is like, and something we'd like to get in the practice of asking everybody, and we've kind of talked about, is like, what is one thing, if you could pick something for somebody to help you out or to kind of invest in you to help you with your ministry?
Time. I'm telling you, dude, because it's one of those things like we get these students for so much time throughout the week, right? And it's one of those things that over the last 8.5 years, like again, being bivocational, having to work a full-time job and being in church, I know Pastor Ronnie's even made the comments too before. He's like, I'd like if you'd be able to get into the schools more, but I'm like, but gosh, I work 8 to 4 in my regular job. That's school hours. If I do get into schools, like I've spoken to FCA maybe a few times, throughout the last several years, not as much as I would, like, because I'd like to be able to do more. And that requires, being there at like 7 a.m., which if I can do it, I'd love to do it. But it's one of those things, and I struggled with it, and I still do kind of struggle with it because it's like I want to do more. I always feel like I'm not doing quite enough. And then sometimes I feel like I'm doing way too much. It's a weird balance. I don't know how to describe it. If you're not in it, I guess you don't really know. But man, because the time that we have with these kids is so crucial. And I don't know how much people understand that really. And I guess that's why it eats at me sometimes. And I've talked to Andre about it before over the years and stuff like that. It's like, man, I wish that these kids could really understand sometimes like what all I'm trying to do to invest.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about how, as being youth leaders and, youth pastor and all that, as kids, we took some of that stuff for granted. Some of the time that is invested into events and, whether it be a fundraiser or a fun night, like our game night, we're, killing ourselves and we go home and we're exhausted and still come in and do podcasts and whatever else. Sure. And so all the things behind the scenes and whatnot. So I guess our biggest thing is just say, thank you for what you do serving wise. And if there's anybody that would be interested in coming in and us interviewing you, more than likely it'll be like me and Matt on this side and maybe you on this side. When we eventually get 3 cameras, we'll move it that way. And so the framework is we're going to eventually send you guys questions and stuff. We're not just going to pop it up on you.
Yeah, no.
And kind of ruin you. And, you get stressed out. We try to make a nice, calming environment. We try to feed off each other. And,
absolutely.
With the framework of, glorifying God. But again, Matt, thank you for all that you do for our church. Keep it up. You don't have
to thank me.
We definitely see your passion as you say these things. And I'm like, man, this guy does a lot. And so definitely be praying for him. We're praying for this ministry and this podcast and, the people that do serve.
So. Just pray for our leaders in general, because Shannon and Matthew do a lot to help with the youth ministry too. And on top of that, I look at like the position I'm in now, like where I'm at in life, where I'm at in my faith and what we're doing now. It's people that are invested in, whether it's youth group, children's, whatever, older adults, whatever it may be. Like, because if it wasn't for the youth leaders that I had, and like I was talking about time, that was always the most important thing to me, even as a youth, because I had leaders that took time, in their lives, whether they had to make the time or they had the time to invest into me, like during church hours or even outside of church hours, which was super important, which I'd love to be able to do more. But again, it's so hard, with the way my schedule is right now. But time is of the utmost importance. And because those leaders, loved me, loved all the other students that were in our youth group and stuff like that, that's so important. So like when we do these servant spotlights and everything, you'll really get to see like the heart of the people that are behind the scenes of like that you see on an everyday Sunday, like, whether they're, leading the worship or preaching or working in children's church or, cutting grass on a Saturday or whatever. Like you really get to get the behind the scenes of it. And it's not to like, we're not trying to like glorify people and be like, oh, you need to appreciate them more or whatever. But, and again, too, it's like, you'll have a better appreciation for what it is that we're doing to advance the kingdom and to build the kingdom. And it really does help you to want to do more, I guess I should say, because like we always talk about, like we really want people to serve and be invested. And I think it's one of those things you don't really understand it until you get those stories. And that's kind of like why we want to do these servant spotlights, because we really want you to see the heart of these people. And some people may not want to do it because again, I don't want the spotlight.
No pressure.
It was weird for me to like do stuff like this, and I didn't talk too much because I would have took a lot of time to explain a lot of this stuff. But we don't want like it feels weird when people are like, oh, we appreciate what you do. Cause I'm like, if I say thank you, I feel like I'm being like, oh, thank you. That's the way it feels to me, even though I know people aren't going to take it that way, but I just don't know what to say when people give me compliments about ministry. So I just kind of like, I appreciate it and move on. Cause it's weird to me to get a compliment to do ministry. Cause I feel like I shouldn't be getting compliments. I'm just doing what I'm called to do. So
right. And so I think there's that love response there. And we've kind of talked about before is like how, Paul would say like, we thank the Lord for you. And that is just one of the like best compliments because you're kind of taking that thankfulness and you're putting back towards the Lord. So that's a very great framework to think about it. And
well, to end on a high note, I guess I should say, I'm thankful for Northside, thankful for them giving me the opportunity to some kid 8.5 years ago to come in and trust me with their students and to, guide them in their faith and build their faith and strengthen the Lord. So I appreciate this church for all that they do and continue to do for me and what they'll continue to do for me in the future. Cause I'm in for the long haul. So I can't wait to see more of what God's going to do in our youth ministry this year and just as our church as a whole. So thank you guys for what y'all do and having me here. So
thank you. Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us. See you next week.